Hey everyone, welcome to Thanks for Sharing. I'm your host, Jackie Pack. Today's episode was requested from two different clients that I work with who, within a fairly short period of time, asked me to record an episode on touch. From my own experience, I already know that touch can be incredibly complicated. What struck me was that they were asking different questions. Yeah, I realized they were really asking about the same thing. They were asking about touch, but they were also asking about touch within relationships, close relationships, intimate relationships, family relationships, friendships, and those relationships that aren't so close, relationships that are just beginning, and relationships that have existed for years. One client asked me very practical questions. Should I hug someone from the side or straight on? What do I do with my arms? Is there a right kind of hug? And one of the things I appreciate about this client is he asks thoughtful questions. Not because he's looking for rules. I think because he's genuinely trying to become a more intentional person. So he came into a session and said he'd been thinking about touch and hugging. He had seen a video about actor Keanu Reeves and noticed that when people approach him for a hug, he often wraps his arms around them, but leaves a little space between their bodies. He doesn't actually touch them. And that got him wondering, should I be doing that? My first thought was context matters. Keanu Reeves is a celebrity. He's interacting with strangers every day. He doesn't know their backstories. He doesn't know how a picture might be interpreted when it's shared online. Leaving a little space is probably a very reasonable and safe boundary in that situation. Most of us aren't living in that reality. So rather than asking, what's the right kind of hug? I think the better question is, what does this relationship call for? He asked me another question I thought was really insightful. He said, when I hug my wife, I like a full hug. I like the closeness. I like to feel her up against my chest. But I don't want another woman to wonder what I'm communicating. And I don't want to communicate something I'm not intending. I appreciated that question. He's not asking, how close can he get before it's inappropriate? He's asking how to be thoughtful, how to let his touch communicate what he actually intends. And I think that's a different question. I don't think there is one correct way to hug. Sometimes a side hug makes perfect sense. Sometimes a front-facing hug between longtime friends or family members feels completely natural. Sometimes a handshake is more appropriate. And sometimes someone doesn't want to be hugged at all. And that's important to know. Healthy touch isn't about memorizing one right technique. It's about awareness. Awareness of yourself, awareness of the other person, awareness of the relationship, and awareness of what you're trying to communicate. He also asked about the mechanics. Where do my arms go? What if there's a height difference? What if our bodies touch? Those are practical questions, and I think maybe a lot of people wonder about that. Generally speaking, most adults naturally place one arm a little higher across the upper back or shoulder, and the other around the upper back or rib cage, adjusting for height and comfort. The goal isn't perfect choreography. The goal is respect. A brief hug between two adults may involve incidental body contact. Bodies are bodies. The important question isn't whether every part of the hug can be engineered to avoid normal contact. I think the important question is whether the hug is welcome, appropriate for the relationship, and communicates the respect and warmth that you intend. He also asked me about different kinds of touch, like a light feather touch, a firm touch, or an intentional touch. That question reminded me that the same physical contact can convey very different meanings depending on the relationship and context. A light, feathery touch on the arm might feel flirtatious in one situation and comforting in another. A firm hand on someone's shoulder might feel grounding, supportive, and reassuring. Or it could feel controlling. I don't think the meaning is found in the touch itself. It's found in the context of the relationship. And then his wife interjected. She was in the session. And she shared something that became the heart of the conversation. She said, everyone in his family hugs. They're very big huggers. Now, at first glance, that can sound like a very affectionate family. But I've also worked with this client for several years, so I have an understanding of his family system. He explained the hugs usually came at some point during conflict, and they signaled conflict is over. Not after repair, but instead of repair. Nothing was resolved. And that message wasn't spoken out loud. Everyone understood it. We've hugged, so we're done. This is over. Even if resentment was still there, even if nothing had actually been resolved. In his family, the hug wasn't communicating connection and affection. It was communicating, we're not going to talk about this anymore. And that's very different. Healthy touch doesn't replace repair. Healthy touch could be an expression of repair, but those aren't the same thing. If a child repeatedly experiences hugs that ask them to ignore their own hurt, to stop talking, or to pretend everything is okay when it isn't, touch itself can become confusing. The body is experiencing closeness, the relationship isn't. And that creates incongruence. It makes sense that as an adult, he tended to downplay hugs. Not because he disliked affection, but because affection and authenticity had become disconnected. As we've worked together over the years, for him, that started to change. After one of our men's groups, he realized something that had maybe never occurred to him before. He said, after one of our discussions in men's group that he was a part of, he realized something that I think had never occurred to him before. He said, I don't think I've ever kissed my sons. His sons are adults now. He loved them deeply, but kissing them simply wasn't part of what he'd inherited. Since then, he's kissed one of his sons. He kisses his grandson. And I love that story. Not because I think every father should kiss their adult sons. I don't think that's the point. The point is that he realized he had more options than what he inherited. He was expanding his capacity to express love. And to me, that's what healing often looks like. Not becoming someone completely different, not swinging to the opposite extreme, but recognizing that our adaptations aren't our destiny. We can choose which parts of what we inherited we want to carry forward and which parts we want to transform. The second client who asked me to record this episode is a woman I've worked with for several years. Her question couldn't have been more different, but in a lot of ways, it was exactly the same. She'd recently gone on a date. Her date wanted to hold her hand. And she realized that she wasn't comfortable with that yet. She had to tell him several times she wasn't ready because they didn't really know each other. And he kept pressing. Afterward, in our session, she told me, I know a lot of people probably wouldn't think holding hands is a big deal, but it was to her. I told her I thought it was a very big deal. Over the years, we've done a lot of work together around childhood experiences, touch, learning to trust herself, and learning that she has a voice. Several years ago, she probably wouldn't have spoken up. Several years ago, she wasn't even interested in dating at all. And she was much more comfortable ignoring her own discomfort. Had this same experience happened 3 years ago, she may have worried about disappointing him. Instead, she noticed what her body was telling her. She communicated it clearly, several times. And when he couldn't respect that boundary, she decided she didn't want to go on another date. And to me, that's a success story. The success story is she trusted herself. These two conversations got me thinking. Yes, this episode is about touch, but it isn't only about touch. It's about what touch comes to mean within our relationships. It's about how we learn to give and receive affection, how we learn what feels safe, how we learn what feels uncomfortable, how we learn what our bodies say yes to and what they say not yet to, and sometimes what they say no to. Because I don't think touch is just physical contact. I think touch is one of the earliest languages through which we learn what relationships are, what relationships mean, and whether relationships feel safe. I think one of the questions we rarely ask ourselves is, what did touch teach me from the time I was young? Not just, did my family hug? Or did they not hug? But what did touch actually come to mean? Because touch, I don't think, is really just ever touch. Touch communicates something. Sometimes it communicates comfort, safety, sometimes delight, affection, sometimes reassurance, sometimes protection, celebration, grief, and sometimes love. But touch can also communicate very different things. It can communicate fear, control, obligation, shame, manipulation, confusion, and its absence can hold a meaning all on its own. As I've been thinking about this episode over the last couple of weeks, I realized every family develops a language of touch. Every family has rules. Most of those rules are never spoken out loud. They're simply lived. Some families hug every time they see each other. Some never hug. Some kiss everyone on the cheek. Some shake hands. Some people grow up with parents who rub their backs when they're upset. Others can't remember ever being held when they cried. Some families are very physically affectionate. Others show love almost entirely through acts of service or words. And none of those things by themselves tell us whether a family is healthy or unhealthy. The important question is, what did that touch or lack of touch come to mean? For me, touch was either abusive or it wasn't there. That taught my nervous system something. It taught me that closeness wasn't safe. It taught me that relationships eventually hurt. Now, I want to be careful here because I'm not saying everyone who grows up with abuse becomes touch avoidant, or that everyone who grows up in unaffectionate families struggle with intimacy. People adapt differently. Some people, like me, avoid touch. Others crave it. Some become very physically affectionate. Others become uncomfortable with almost all physical contact. And almost all of those adaptations make sense when we understand the story behind them. There's something I've been saying throughout my career. I recorded an episode a couple episodes ago on it. All behavior makes sense. I'd add something else for today's episode. I think every relationship with touch makes sense as well. When we understand what touch meant in someone's family, their adult relationship with touch often becomes a lot clearer. Our adaptations made sense in the world we grew up in. But our adaptations aren't our destiny. The male client, when he asked me to record this episode, referenced a conversation we had had in men's group when he was part of it. We were talking about Pia Melody's ideas around traits of functional adults. Specifically, that healthy adults can ask others to help meet their needs while also learning to meet many of those needs themselves. One of the men in the group asked, "What about touch? You can't meet that need yourself." And it started an interesting discussion. I said, actually, I think we can meet some of our need for touch ourselves. I don't mean in exactly the same way another person can. Those are different experiences. But as I thought about it, I acknowledged there's probably some differences between females and males. Every morning and night, I wash my face. I moisturize it. I put lotion on my skin. I told the men, you should too. We live in a desert. Sometimes more than once a day, I'll put lotion on my hands. Often after washing my hands, I reapply lotion and I'll slow down enough to actually feel myself rubbing it in, not just accomplishing it like it's a task. Sometimes when I'm sitting with a client in a session, I'll notice myself gently rubbing my own arm while I'm thinking. We can hug ourselves. We can wrap our arms around ourselves. We can wrap ourselves in a blanket. We can receive the warmth of a bath or a hot cup of tea. We can notice the feeling of the sun on our skin. Those experiences don't replace healthy relationships, but they do remind us that our relationship with touch begins with our relationship to our own body. And that's something many of us were never taught. Something also started to evolve going forward from that group discussion. For our ending ritual of group a few weeks later, one of the men said, "I think we should hug." I asked, "Like a big group hug?" He said, "No, individually, one-on-one. I think we should go around and hug each person individually." So they started that night at the end of group. Then it evolved to when they were arriving to group. The first person to be in the group room stands up and hugs the next person as they're coming in. Then when the third person comes in, the other two stand up and hug the new arrival. And I've noticed, whether it's at the beginning of group or at the end of group, they look around to make sure they hugged everyone when they get there and when they leave. Today, that's simply what the group does. Not because it's expected or because it's a rule, but because it's become a meaningful expression of connection within that group. A few rounds ago, a new member introduced himself and said, "I'm really not comfortable with hugs, but I'm happy to shake hands or fist bump." That wasn't a problem. Each week, the men greeted one another. They hugged the men who wanted hugs, and they shook his hand or gave him a fist bump. Nobody questioned him. Nobody tried to persuade him. And it didn't seem like anybody took it personally. His boundary was simply respected. After 4 or 5 weeks into his second round of group, he walked into group and said, "I'm comfortable with hugs now." One of our regular group members happened to miss that week. When he came back the following week, he noticed the new member hugging everyone and asked, "Wait, when did that change?" The newer member smiled and said, "Last week." And then he explained to the group, "I think watching you guys and getting to know all of you and what you're willing to share with each other has helped me become more comfortable with hugs." I love that story because it reminds me that healthy touch isn't something we can force. It's something that grows in the context of safety. The relationship changed first, hugs came later. And I think that's true of so much healing. When our boundaries are respected, when we're accepted where we are, and when we experience consistency over time, our nervous system begins to discover that maybe this relationship isn't like the ones that first taught us what relationships were. As I said, when I was growing up, touch in my family was either abusive or absent. There really was not much in between. Looking back, I realized for me, I became very touch avoidant. At the time, I don't know that I would have described myself that way. I simply believed relationships were dangerous. I thought all relationships ended painfully. One of the songs I listened to over and over as a teenager was Simon and Garfunkel's "I Am a Rock." I didn't just enjoy the music. I heard the lyrics to that song as wisdom. I heard them like an instruction manual, and I followed that teaching. The message I took away seemed fairly simple. Don't let people get close. If you don't need people, they can't hurt you. I remember listening to that song and thinking, yes, that's what I'm going for. Check, check, got it. It matched everything I believed. By the time I got to high school, I could be friends with boys. In fact, I enjoyed having guy friends, as long as they only saw me as a friend. I was completely comfortable. But the moment I thought they might like me romantically, it was done. I would pull away. I knew I wasn't going to have romantic relationships or a boyfriend because that was not part of the manual. I thought I was being smart. I thought I understood how relationships worked. I had spent years watching my parents fight. I had watched other couples in my neighborhood or at church. Sometimes I babysat in their home and overheard their fights. And then I met Jeff, my husband now. We became friends first, really good friends. He wanted the relationship to become something more long before I was ready. And to his credit, he knew me, so he didn't pressure me. He stayed in the friend zone because he knew that's where I could tolerate being. And eventually, very slowly, our friendship began changing. As we were negotiating this, I remember saying to him something I thought was completely obvious. I said, "We can be friends forever, or we can become boyfriend and girlfriend for a little while, and then we'll hate each other." I'll never forget his response. He looked at me and said, "Why would we hate each other?" I remember thinking, "You're so incredibly naive." Because in my mind, that's just what happened. Relationships always ended, and they always ended poorly. Looking back now, I realized something I couldn't have understood then. I wasn't describing relationships. Although I thought I had a good sample size, I was describing the only relationships I'd ever known. As children, we don't just survive our families. We often mistake our families for the whole world. Our home becomes our first classroom. It's where we learn what love looks like, what conflict looks like, what trust looks like, what touch means, and whether vulnerability is safe, whether people stay, and whether our needs matter. As children, we don't have anything to compare our family to. We don't think my family communicates this way. We think this is how families communicate. We don't think my parents fight like this. We think this is what marriage looks like. We don't think touch in my family feels unsafe. We think this is what touch means. Or maybe that's just me, but I don't think so. For years, I thought the world was scary. It took me a very long time to realize something that changed my perspective. The world wasn't necessarily what I was afraid of, but my childhood home had been my world, and I had mistaken that world for reality itself. I see so many clients make this same mistake all the time. Not because they're irrational, but because all of us build our understanding of relationships from a very small sample size. One of the things I hope you've heard throughout this episode is that healing isn't about forcing ourselves to become comfortable with touch. It's about becoming more aware, more intentional, more congruent. And I've been thinking about two little words throughout this entire episode: not yet. I think healthy relationships don't just respect a yes, they respect a not yet. My female client wasn't saying she never wanted to hold hands. She was saying, not yet. The newer member in the men's group wasn't saying, I'll never hug anyone. He was saying, not yet. The difference wasn't found in them. The difference was found in how the other person responded. One person continued to push. The group simply said, okay. One relationship became less safe. The other became more safe. And I think that's one of the clearest indicators of emotional maturity. Can I respect another person's pace without making it about me? Can I hear not yet without hearing rejection? Do I hear not yet instead of a clear no? Can I allow trust to develop instead of trying to rush it? Because trust rarely grows through pressure. Trust grows through consistency. It grows when our words and our actions match. It grows when our bodies begin to experience something different than what they learned years ago. That's how our old maps begin to change. Not because someone argues you out of them, but because we experience enough new evidence that our nervous system begins to believe something different is possible. The question that came up in my men's group was whether we can meet any of our own need for touch. I think we can. Not in the way another person can. Healthy relationships offer something unique that we can't completely create on our own. But I do think many of us have never learned to have a compassionate relationship with our own body. Sometimes during a therapy session, if I'm thinking or listening carefully, I'll notice myself gently rubbing my arm or my hand cupping the side of my face. I'm not doing it consciously. It's simply a way my body regulates itself. Sometimes wrapping yourself in a blanket, resting your hand over your heart, or noticing the warmth of the sun on your skin can become small reminders that your body deserves kindness. Those moments don't replace healthy relationships, but they do begin changing the relationship you have with yourself. And I think that's where integration begins. Over the years, I've come to believe that my adaptations and my clients' adaptations made perfect sense. They protected us. They helped us survive. My walls protected me. My client's hesitation protected her. My other client's uncertainty about touch made sense, given what Huds had come to mean in his family. None of these adaptations were failures. They were intelligent solutions created by a younger version of ourselves who was trying to stay safe. But here's the hopeful part. And I've already said this a couple times. Our adaptations aren't our destiny. We don't have to shame them. We don't have to pretend they never existed. We can thank them for protecting us and allow ourselves to slowly begin developing new capacities. The capacity to trust, the capacity to receive comfort, the capacity to respect another person's boundaries, and the capacity to say not yet without shame, the capacity to hear not yet without taking it personally, and the capacity to offer affection that is genuine rather than obligatory. The capacity to experience touch as something that communicates safety instead of fear. To me, that's what becoming more integrated looks like. It's not becoming someone else. It's becoming more fully yourself. Not the self that was organized around survival. The self that now has the freedom to choose connection with wisdom, discernment, and agency. If our earliest experiences became our first map of relationships, the question becomes, how do we build a different map? We don't build it by pretending the first one never existed. We don't build it by criticizing ourselves for having it. And we don't build it by forcing ourselves into situations our nervous system isn't ready for. We build it one relationship at a time. We build it when somebody respects our not yet. We build it when our boundaries are honored instead of challenged. We build it when touch matches the relationship instead of replacing repair. We build it when words, actions, emotions, and touch become congruent. We build it when we experience consistency over time. We build it when our nervous system has had enough new experiences to begin updating what it learned long ago. These are all corrective relational experiences. We build a different map through repeated experiences that differ from those that created the first map. Maps don't usually change because someone gives us better directions. They change because we travel somewhere new. When I started college, I lived about 4 hours from home in student housing. There were 2 football players who sat behind me in one of my classes all semester. Well, one sat right behind me and the one sat across from him. I barely talked to them. Toward the end of the semester, I'm sitting in class and I suddenly feel someone touch the back of my head. I stiffen. I turned around and I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I've been sitting behind you all semester wanting to touch your hair because it looks so soft." I looked at him and replied, "I'm not a dog. You don't just pet me." That night, there was a knock on the trailer door where my roommates and I lived. I opened the front door and these 2 guys were standing there. I asked, "What are you doing here?" They said they'd come to apologize. And they also wanted to get to know the girls who lived here, who had a ceiling to floor poster of James Dean. People driving by could see from the street. My 2 roommates were home. One came out and invited them to come in. Over the remaining months of that school year, we became friends with them. Keith and Roger would often tease me, saying I was so stern and businesslike. And I would say, "You were petting my hair." But they weren't wrong. I was awkward. I wasn't trying to be intimidating, but I knew it could probably come across as stern and businesslike. I didn't know how to let people in. Looking back now, I don't feel embarrassed about setting a boundary. I'm actually proud of that younger self. Though she was awkward, she did trust her instincts, even though her instincts were probably dialed up a little too high. One of the things I realize when I think about that experience and the friendship that developed from it is remembering that I didn't yet know there were people who would respect my boundary, apologize, and patiently earn my trust. Looking back now, I realize something else. By that point, I already knew Jeff. We'd been friends for 3 years. We were still just friends. We started dating that summer when I went home between my first and second year of college. Jeff had been incredibly patient with me. He respected my very awkward boundaries. He respected how slowly I trusted. He never made me feel bad for needing the pace that I needed. And he was safe. So I already knew there was one person like that. What I didn't know was that there were other people like that. When Keith and Roger showed up at my door to apologize, they weren't just apologizing for touching my hair. Without realizing it, they were expanding my map. They were teaching me that there were other people who could hear a boundary, respect it, repair it, and still want a relationship. I didn't know that yet. I thought Jeff was the exception. Over time, I discovered he wasn't. There were more people in the world who were capable of that kind of respect than my younger self ever imagined. And I'm really glad to know that. As I've been preparing this episode, I found myself thinking a lot about that younger version of me. If I'm honest, there's a part of me that still feels a little embarrassed when I look back at how convinced I was that relationships always ended badly. And as a result of that belief, how awkward I could be. How certain I was that the safest way to live was behind walls. Thick, strong walls. I believe that song, I Am a Rock, was telling me the truth. It was reinforcing the truth I had learned. One of the lines from that song says, I touch no one and no one touches me. Keith and Roger had no way of knowing how carefully I had constructed that wall, that they just went right around. But then I remind myself, I do know her. She's still part of me. I know the world she grew up in. I know why she built those walls. I know what she was trying to protect. She wasn't weak, but she was deeply wounded. She had been hurt in ways she didn't understand yet, and she was trying to survive. And parts of her had learned to disappear in order to survive. She'd become fractured in ways that made perfect sense given the world she grew up in. And she built walls that helped her survive. But she wasn't beyond hope. Those walls did exactly what they were designed to do. They kept her safe in the only world she knew. There was a time when I thought that song was wisdom. It felt like a blueprint for survival. If I could become like that rock, if I didn't need people, if I didn't let them get too close, then I wouldn't get hurt. The song ends by saying, and a rock feels no pain, and an island never cries. Seemed like a good way to live to me. For a long time, that was the goal. Then life slowly began expanding my map. First, through a friendship with Jeff that taught me relationships didn't have to move faster than I was ready for. That a relationship could expand to meet my needs. Then through other people who respected my boundaries, apologized when they crossed them, and still saw something that made them stay. Over the years, I've also realized something. It wasn't that I didn't feel pain, and it wasn't that I never cried. I had become very good at simply turning the tears off. But what I've learned since then is that there are different kinds of pain. There's the pain of being harmed, and the pain of abuse, the pain of betrayal, the pain when relationships aren't safe. That was the pain my younger self was trying so hard to numb and avoid. But there's another kind of pain. The pain of watching my daughters lose a friendship. The pain of seeing one of them go through the end of a relationship with a boyfriend, even when ending it was the healthiest outcome. The pain of watching one of my daughters not make the team she had worked so hard to make. And wishing I could take that disappointment away. I couldn't, but I'm so glad that I learned. In those moments, I could cry with them. And that maybe all I could do was hold them while they cried. Sometimes gently, rubbing their back. I'm so glad that I expanded and could do that. There was the pain of crying with my husband after the death of his father and the death of my mom. That isn't the pain I spent my childhood trying to avoid. That's the pain that comes from loving and being loved. Today, I don't believe the goal is to avoid pain. I think the goal is to become wise enough to distinguish between the pain that signals harm and the pain that comes from deep connection. One asks us to protect ourselves. The other reminds us that we've loved. If I could go back and talk to that younger version of myself, I wouldn't tell her to tear the walls down. I don't think she even could do that. But I would tell her to keep paying attention. Because one day she'd discover that her family wasn't the whole world. That there were relationships where touch could be safe, where boundaries were respected, where not yet would be honored, where repair was real and love didn't require pretending, where connection didn't mean losing herself. That's what healing has been for me. Not becoming someone different, and not pretending my adaptations never existed, but becoming a more integrated version of myself. The walls did protect me, but they were never meant to become my permanent home. And today when I hear those final words, a rock feels no pain and an island never cries, I hear them differently. Because I've learned that feeling pain isn't always a sign that something has gone wrong. It's not always a sign that I'm in danger. More often today, it's a sign that I've loved well and that I've been loved. And for me, that's a life worth living. At the end of this episode, I want to remind you that your story matters. There's something meaningful in every chapter. Don't wait to share your story until it's finished. Until next time, Jackie.